Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We appreciate those who are joining us on our heritage.org website as well during this occasion. I would ask everyone here in-house if you'll be so kind to check your cell phones one last time to see that they've been turned off as a courtesy. And of course, we will post the program on the Heritage homepage following today's event for everyone's future reference. Hosting our special guest and introducing our program today is Dr. Niall Gardner, director of our Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. He also served as a former aide to Lady Thatcher. He has worked at the heart of Washington policy for over a decade and is a leading expert on the U.S.-UK special relationship. He is also a regular contributor to the London Daily Telegraph and appears frequently on American and British television. Having received his doctorate in history from Yale University, please join me in welcoming Niall Gardner. Niall?
Thanks very much, John. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and the 9th Margaret Thatcher Freedom Lecture. My former boss, Lady Thatcher, was a political titan whose principles and ideals continue to inspire the defenders of freedom all over the globe. The world is a far better place due to the leadership of the grocer's daughter from Grantham, who rose from humble origins to become Britain's highest leader. By standing up for conservative values, Lady Thatcher won 3 British general elections, not by shifting her policies, adapting her ideology, or compromising her beliefs. She won by sticking to clearly defined conservative principles that rested upon a crystal-clear vision of individual liberty, limited government, strong defense, and faith in the greatness of her country. For the Iron Lady, leadership was not about pandering to the latest political fashions or appealing to special interest groups. Her political vision was constant and unwavering, based on principles and ideals, not fads. And she reminded the world that the role of government is to serve the people, not to lord over them. As she once remarked, we believe that individuals have a right to liberty that no state can take away, that government is the servant of the people, not its master. Not only did Margaret Thatcher restore Great Britain's confidence, but she also helped restore America's too, playing a key role in the Reagan Revolution. She possessed an unshakable belief in the greatness of the United States, the spirit of its people, and its ability to lead. To Lady Thatcher, America was and is a truly exceptional nation, one founded on the principles of individual liberty, enshrined in a constitution that protects the rights of all its citizens. In her words, the United States is the greatest country in the free world, a country born to be free, one with an awesome responsibility. And it was her firm belief that the United States was strongest when working together with key allies, especially her closest friend, Great Britain. The Anglo-American special relationship is indeed the beating heart of the free world and the most successful partnership of modern times. It is my great pleasure to introduce today a US politician who Margaret Thatcher would have described as one of us, a senator dedicated to advancing so many of the same principles deeply cherished by the Iron Lady. Ted Cruz was elected in 2012 as the 34th US Senator from Texas after receiving national acclaim as the Solicitor General of Texas. Serving under Attorney General Greg Abbott, he was the nation's youngest Solicitor General, the longest-serving Solicitor General in Texas history, and the first Hispanic Solicitor General of Texas. He was propelled into Congress by tens of thousands of grassroots activists, with his election described by the Washington Post as the biggest upset of 2012, a true grassroots victory against very long odds. In the Senate, Ted Cruz has been a passionate fighter for limited government, economic growth, and the Constitution, never afraid to stand up for conservative ideals and the rule of law. In surveying his record in the Senate, I am reminded of Margaret Thatcher's firm belief that it is the half-hearted who lose, it is those with conviction who carry the day. Please join me in welcoming Senator Ted Cruz.
Thank you very much, Niall, for that very kind introduction. I am honored to have the chance to join you. I appreciate your leadership here at the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at Heritage. Both the center and your work embody the very special relationship between our two countries. And I want to thank in particular my good friend Senator Jim DeMint for his extraordinary leadership here at Heritage and the incredible difference he makes each and every day. It is a privilege to be with you. You know, I'm reminded at the outset of one of my favorite stories involving Lady Thatcher, and it has to do with my tenure as Solicitor General in Texas. About a decade ago, when I was SG, my boss, Attorney General Greg Abbott, getting ready to be the next governor of Texas, was preparing to argue in front of the U.S. Supreme Court in defense of the Texas Ten Commandments monument. It's a case we had worked on. We litigated from the trial court all the way on up. It was going to be General Abbott's first argument in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, and he had worked many, many months getting ready for the argument. And General Abbott's entire team decided we were going to come together and get him a painting to commemorate it. As you know, they don't allow cameras in the Supreme Court, so you have artists that draw the scene. So we reached out to an artist and said all of General Abbott's senior staff, we wanted to give him a painting of his first argument. And the artist asked, since an argument's fairly short, he said, can you give me a picture of Abbott so that I can have a picture to remind myself as I'm finishing up the painting to make sure to get the details right? And General Abbott's wife, Cecilia, was coming to the argument as well, and we asked, can you make sure to include Cecilia in the audience, just because it's a particularly nice thing to have, if you have a painting on the wall, to have your wife there at the argument. And so he asked, can you also get us a picture of Cecilia? Well, the only picture that we could find was hanging in General Abbott's office, and we had to do this surreptitiously because he didn't know about this. But we snuck it off the wall and took it, and it was a picture of Greg Abbott, of his wife Cecilia, and of Lady Thatcher. And he had the opportunity to meet Lady Thatcher. It's a wonderful picture. So we sent it to the artist, and I will admit, if you are an appellate litigator and Supreme Court litigator, part of what you do is you imagine everything that could possibly go wrong. So it occurred to me there was a potential foul-up that could happen here. So I was trying to find a way to communicate to the artist, but the artist is a very nice man who I got to know and became friends. I didn't want to be condescending and presume that he wouldn't know who Lady Thatcher was. But on the other hand, I was very, very worried that we'd get back a painting of General Abbott arguing and Lady Thatcher sitting in the front row watching him. So I tried to just say, here's the picture of General Abbott, and on his left is Cecilia, and to specify exactly who it was, and it turned out the painting came out exactly right, and they had Cecilia there. But I've always envisioned how Lady Thatcher almost was in spirit at the Supreme Court argument in defense of the Texas Ten Commandments monument. You know, we're gathered here today to talk about one of the greatest resources that America has traditionally enjoyed, which is the power of our friendships across the globe. One of the sad legacies we've seen of the last 6 years is a fraying of friendships and alliances across the world. The combination of a strong global network of allies with the credible threat of force against our enemies has formed the basis for a successful American foreign policy that has made the world a safer and more prosperous place. Unfortunately, what we've seen over the last 6 years is a reversal of that trend. Today, the consequences of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy is that our friends no longer trust us, and our enemies no longer fear us. That is profoundly dangerous for America and is profoundly dangerous for the world. What I want to discuss today is how we reverse that trend, how we change course, how we can see our friends and allies, both along with our enemies, for who they really are, and how we can advance the interests and national security of the United States across the world. I want to start a little by talking about the special relationship America and Great Britain have enjoyed, which has been so much to our mutual benefit. It has to be admitted, though, however awkwardly, for purposes of a speech on friendship at the Margaret Thatcher Center, that the United Kingdom was actually our first major enemy. But it's an excellent lesson in how relationships can change. The ties of language and culture and values that stretch across the Atlantic proved far stronger than the unpleasantness that took place between 1775 and 1850. Perhaps our strongest bond is a shared commitment to the democratic principles that have survived from antiquity, a tradition that in Britain emerged in the shade of a large tree when King John signed the Magna Carta on June 15th, 1215. A momentous acknowledgement that even a monarch can be subject to the rule of law. When we honor the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta next year, we'll be celebrating the bedrock of the free systems of both the UK and the United States. It will be an important opportunity for us to reaffirm our commitment to the rule of law as outlined in the Constitution, which is based on the principles of separation of powers laid out in the Magna Carta, namely that no man is above the law, especially not the President of the United States. That is an admonition that is particularly relevant today, as we see a president who routinely disregards the constitutional limitations on his authority and the principles of separation of powers and federalism. We are reminded today of the admonition of Thomas Jefferson that our Constitution serves as chains to bind the mischief of government. Well, there is plenty of mischief in Washington, D.C. today. Another great milestone for liberty occurred in 1689 when King William and Queen Mary signed the Bill of Rights that established the fundamentally republican principles, that's small r, of Great Britain, including the need for Parliament to consent to the suspension or execution of laws, the right to free speech, and the protection against cruel and unusual punishment. This remarkable achievement, in turn, inspired the audacious inhabitants of the British colonies in the New World to demand these same freedoms. And when they were denied, they took matters into their own hands. With the benefit of hindsight, it could be argued that this was an act befitting the descendants of men and women who had pledged to respect, but not to idolize, their sovereign. The United States quickly proved itself a unique ally to Great Britain, and the so-called special relationship was born. Our friendship is so profound today that the very notion that we were once sworn enemies seems so strange as to be laughable. Indeed, we have weathered some of the darkest hours together, fighting in the 20th century through the trenches of 2 world wars, as well as side by side winning the Cold War. It is a particular honor to address you today in the context of that friendship, and particularly in the memory of Margaret Thatcher. In the distinguished pantheon of great British friends to the United States, including such luminaries as Winston Churchill, whose bust, I might note, sits in my office. There is perhaps none greater than Lady Thatcher, in no small measure because of the profound friendship and alliance she had with her American counterpart, Ronald Reagan. It is truly a demonstration of God's providential hand on our nation and on the world that President Reagan and Lady Thatcher and Pope John Paul all arose to leadership at the same time, and together came together to win the Cold War without firing a shot. If there has been a greater victory for peace, for the freedom of more people across the globe, I know not what it is. This was a classic example of an alliance projecting a strength that is substantially more than the sum of its parts. As Reagan and Thatcher together reversed the policy of détente towards the Soviets and instead followed the simple strategy, we win, they lose. A strategy which I might note the cognoscenti in both Washington and London tittered upon hearing it, as it being unlettered, as it being Philistine, as it not understanding nuance. And yet it proved principled in insight in a way that far surpassed prior approaches. Most recently, our countries have found ourselves fighting alongside each other again, this time in the front lines in the war against radical Islamic terrorists. We've seen brutal terrorist attack on our own soil and on British soil. We've seen radicalized citizens of both nations travel to the Middle East to join terrorist groups like ISIS, in a stark demonstration of how closely we're aligned. When ISIS began its vicious rampage of staged beheadings this summer, the first victim was an American, Jonathan Foley, and the second was Stephen Sotloff, a dual Israeli-American citizen, and the third was British, David Haines. In addition, one of the most recent victims, the photojournalist Luke Summers, was a dual U.S.-UK citizen. His al-Qaeda captors didn't make a distinction between our countries when they shot him during a rescue attempt last Saturday. For them, all representatives of free and tolerant societies are equally abhorrent. A fact that makes today a critical opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to our shared interest and values as we continue partnering with the UK in this fight against this vicious enemy. Part of this partnership is securing our mutual economic prosperity. And one initiative in particular that has been raised here by the Heritage Foundation is noteworthy, which would be a free trade deal with the UK should it choose to leave the European Union after the projected 2017 referendum. While the U.S. continues to pursue the transatlantic trade and investment partnership with the EU, the lengthy and cumbersome process to negotiate this agreement, not to mention the possibility that the world's sixth largest economy would be left out if the UK opts out of the EU, suggest we should be looking for other opportunities to pursue free trade agreements. As Niall Gardner and Theodore Bromwich here at Heritage have both argued, such an agreement between the U.S. and the UK would be an opportunity to mutually deregulate our economies, in contrast to the TTIP, which is proving an exercise in, quote, harmonizing regulations. As we've discovered in Texas, deregulation is a powerful, liberating economic force that can lead to significant economic growth, something Lady Thatcher understood all too well. Such an agreement can also be an aspirational model for other nations, encouraging them to look to bedrock principles of conservatism and individual liberty, of chaining government and freeing free men and women that have made the United Kingdom and the United States such powerful forces for good across the globe. I'd now like to shift gears for a minute and look at some of the enemies we face across the globe before returning the final portion of my remarks to our many friends. And in particular, I'd like to focus on how recent attempts to domesticate long-standing enemies, notably Russia and Iran, have backfired on the Obama administration, and that ironically had prided itself on its unique ability to restore America's reputation abroad. One significant element of this policy has been the imposition of distance between America and our traditional allies, apparently in the hopes that Russia and Iran would see an opportunity to get closer to America if we were no longer prioritizing our special relationships. So, for example, one of President Obama's very first acts after he was inaugurated was to return a bronze bust of Winston Churchill that had been on loan to the White House from British authorities. They offered to extend the loan, but apparently Churchill was no longer welcome in the Oval Office. Another significant element has been the wholesale abdication of any moral high ground previously claimed by the United States and our free allies, with particular eloquence by Reagan and Thatcher. In the Obama-Clinton foreign policy, all members of the international community are equal, be they nations or not, and should be dealt with respectfully and with empathy. Let me be very clear. When it comes to radical Islamic terrorists who are crucifying Christians, who are beheading children, what our foreign policy needs is not additional empathy. It needs clarity and force and resolve to defend the United States of America. The disastrous Russian reset is a case in point. After Vladimir Putin invaded neighboring Georgia in 2008, the incoming Obama administration argued that their new approach would tame the Russian bear. They knew better. Then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton traveled to Geneva armed with a red reset button to emblemize the new approach. The U.S. and Russia would move beyond Russia's violent aggression towards a smaller neighbor and would work on pressing issues such as a new strategic arms reduction treaty, even while Russian tanks and soldiers occupied and continue to occupy sovereign Georgian territory. In an ironic demonstration of how poorly the Obama administration understood the Russians, the word reset was mistranslated on Clinton's reset button, which said, quote, overload instead. At times they spoke truth without even realizing it. The United States offered additional concessions, such as the cancellation of the missile defense batteries for Poland and the Czech Republic, and the lame duck passage of a new START treaty that disproportionately limits our ability to deploy missile defenses. President Obama even promised Putin's henchman, Dmitry Medvedev, that he would have, quote, greater flexibility to make still more concessions after his 2012 re-election. Pause for a moment. Can you imagine President Reagan? Can you imagine Lady Thatcher uttering such words? But of all of this outreach was to no avail, as Putin assessed rightly it to be a demonstration of weakness. 1 year ago, the Russian strongman was preparing not only to host the Olympics Games at Sochi, but also to respond to the audacity of the Ukrainian people who had stood up against his attempts to reintegrate them forcibly into Russia's sphere of influence and who had demanded freedom and greater ties to the West, to Europe, and to America. As President Obama pleaded for a restoration of calm, Putin moved in. He annexed the Crimean Peninsula. He supplied heavy arms and reinforcements to the pro-Russian elements in eastern Ukraine, provoking heavy fighting and a significant loss of life. Notably, the destruction of a civilian passenger plane, Malaysian Airlines Flight 17, with a Russian Buk missile. The sanctions proposed by the administration have had no discernible effect. Indeed, when they were rolled out, the Russian stock market went up because their effect was so negligible. The pleas that Putin accept a, quote, diplomatic off-ramp or adhere to international law have fallen on deaf ears. Indeed, few things sum up how badly the Obama-Clinton foreign policy misunderstands Mr. Putin than President Obama's comments when Russia invaded Crimea that it seems his lawyers are telling him something different than what my lawyers are telling me. Talk about fundamentally misunderstanding the situation. It was not a disagreement in legal interpretation. It was a strong man exercising brute power because he perceived America to be weak. In a speech here at Heritage, a little less than a year ago, on Ukraine and Russia, I suggested there were two things we could do to counter Putin, including immediately ordering the installation of the canceled missile defense batteries for Poland and the Czech Republic, and looking into how we could counter Putin's use of energy as a tool for blackmail with the new resources, the shale revolution we're experiencing here in America. Both of these initiatives would have taken some time to implement, but we have wasted almost a year with no progress on either, and both of them should still be explored. Given Putin's behavior over this period, we might want to consider additional actions, such as investigating options to get America out of the New START treaty that is restricting our options while doing nothing to modify Russia's bad behavior. We should also step up and provide lethal aid to our Ukrainian allies. When President Poroshenko addressed Congress in September, he made a compelling case for that assistance. He told us that he could not fight Russian tanks and missiles with blankets alone. I would note my colleagues in Congress in both parties, in both houses, repeatedly stood to our feet to applaud the notion that America would stand with the Ukrainian people, not just with empty promises and empty blankets, but with a resolve to honor the treaty commitments we have to stand with Ukraine. And I was pleased to co-sponsor S-2828 with a bipartisan group of my colleagues that would authorize anti-tank and anti-armor weapons, among other resources, the purpose of which would be to allow Ukraine to defend its territorial integrity, not to engage in aggression with other nations, simply to defend itself against Russian aggression. Yet the stated policy of the Obama administration remains to withhold the help on the grounds that it might provoke Russia. With all due respect, I think Russia has already been provoked. Weakness is provocative. Russia was provoked by the weakness demonstrated by the Obama administration's first term, and I'm concerned that we are now missing another unique opportunity to take rigorous action against Putin at a moment when plummeting global oil prices and gas prices may weaken his position further. Indeed, my friend and colleague John McCain has a memorable way of describing Russia as a gas station with a country attached. Under Putin, Russia has become a petro-dictatorship, almost exclusively dependent on energy for its economic prosperity and international clout. The fall of the price of oil threatens Putin just as it did the Soviets in the 1980s. And Putin still faces at least some judgment from his own people. And the 2016 Duma elections may prove a referendum on his ongoing rule. Extended energy production that would undermine Putin's monopoly, combined with robust support for our allies in Europe, might well encourage the Russian people to choose a different path. A second demonstration of the Obama administration's policy of outreach to our enemies concerns the nation of Iran. As with Russia, the president came in with preconceived notion that Iran could be turned from an enemy to a friend. In his first inaugural, he declared, quote, "To those who cling to power through corruption and deceit and the silencing of dissent, know that you are on the wrong side of history, but that we will extend a hand if you are willing to unclench your fist." Soon thereafter, President Obama clarified in an interview that he was referring to the nation of Iran. On June 4th, 2009, the president traveled to Cairo to proffer an olive branch to Iran, declaring that despite all the hostage-taking and terror attacks of the last 3 decades, Obama offered a fresh start, another reset, if you will. Quote, "Rather than remain trapped in the past, I have made it clear to Iran's leaders and people that my country is prepared to move forward. The question now is not what Iran is against, but rather what future it wants to build." Just 8 days later, when the Green Revolution erupted over the fraudulent re-election of Mohammad Ahmadinejad, be easier if his name were Smith. Look, a Cuban Texan, there are limits to how many syllables we put in our names. The Iranian people tried to move forward to a new future. But the president and his then Secretary of State chose not to back the protesters agitating for democratic reforms. They let the Green Revolution wither as activists crying out for America were shot in the streets. This failure to act seemed inexplicable at the time, as the liberalization of Iran's theocratic government that frankly declares its intention to declare America and our allies while pursuing nuclear weapons capability and serves as the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism would seem a no-brainer. Here's a hint. If a nation calls you the Great Satan, it ain't good. And with the benefit of hindsight, the choice to remain silent seems all the more bizarre. Supporting a democratic, secular Iran and the opposition may well have alleviated many of the regional challenges we face today. From the violence provoked by the terror groups of Hamas and Hezbollah to the devastation wrought by the rogue regime of Syrian strongman Bashar al-Assad, all of whom are supported by Iran. But the Obama administration had something else in mind, as was revealed with remarkable candor by Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes last January, when he declared that an Iran deal is, quote, the biggest thing Obama will do in his second term on foreign policy. This is health care for us. So pause for a second and let that sink in. That according to the Deputy National Security Advisor to the President, cutting a deal with Iran is going to be the Obamacare of the second term. It's difficult to imagine something more dangerous. Just as Obamacare, the quote, signature achievement of the first term, was designed to fundamentally remake our economy here at home, so an Iranian nuclear deal, foreseen as the signature achievement of the second term, would fundamentally transform America's global posture from the leader of the free world to a dutiful and subservient member of the international community. As it turns out, the administration's myopic focus on negotiating an Iran deal, even a terrible Iran deal, blinded them to other threats. Notably, Putin preparing to invade Ukraine and the threat of ISIS in Syria, both of which were gathering at the time Mr. Rhodes made these remarks and have been allowed to rampage largely unchecked through 2014. At the same time, President Obama has made concession after concession to the Iranian regime to keep them at the negotiating table. Iran has received billions of dollars in economic relief, not only under the original Joint Plan of Action, but also under two subsequent extensions when the negotiations failed to reach a deal. Meanwhile, no centrifuges have been dismantled. No enriched uranium has left Iran. Their ICBM program, which isn't even a part of the negotiations, continues unchecked. And it might be noted, Iran is not developing an ICBM program in order to launch telecom satellites into orbit. The ICBM program of Iran exists for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to carry weapons of mass destruction to America and to our allies and to murder potentially millions of Americans. There are frequent reports of Iran's cheating, even under the weak terms of the JPA. Most recently, allegations that Iran is purchasing more equipment for its heavy water reactor at Arak, which could produce plutonium for a nuclear bomb. And Iran continues to abuse the American citizens it has unjustly detained, most notably Pastor Saeed Abedini and Amir Hekmati. Robert Levinson remains unaccounted for. And just days before the most recent extension of negotiations were announced, Tehran announced another extension, this time of the jail sentence for Washington Post reporter Jason Rezaian on, quote, unspecified charges against the Iranian regime. I say to our friends here in the Fourth Estate, what does it say that the government is happily negotiating with the Iranian mullahs while allowing an American journalist to stay in the squalor of an Iranian prison? What does it say about the values and strength of this administration? It is beyond time to recognize that the administration's Iran policy is a dismal failure, the single greatest threat to U.S. national security we face today. And it is time to start treating Iran's leaders like the enemies they are, while making it clear to the Iranian people that there is a pathway to better relations with the United States. In fact, we have right now a significant opportunity to re-exert pressure on Iran. As with Putin, even with the relaxation of economic sanctions under the JPA, plummeting global oil prices threaten Iran's still fragile economy. Rather than extension after extension after extension of negotiation and relaxations of sanctions, now would be an opportune moment to set a new course. We should declare the nuclear negotiations a failure and move instead to reimpose sanctions right now and make them all the more crippling. We can make clear how those sanctions might be relieved. Indeed, I've filed legislation that would do precisely that, reimpose sanctions, strengthen them, and then lay out a clear path to lifting those sanctions. That path would involve Iran dismantling all 19,000 centrifuges, handing over all of its enriched uranium, dismantling its ICBM program, and stopping being the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. With leaders like Khomeini and the mullahs in Iran, we need more stick and a whole lot less carrot. At the same time that we stand with resolve against nations like Russia and Iran, we need to strengthen and revitalize our friendship and alliances across the globe. And I want to finish these remarks today by talking briefly about those friendships once again. Nothing would inconvenience the Islamic Republic of Iran more than a reaffirmation of the Israeli-American alliance as unshakable and a cornerstone of our Middle East policy. While it's true that Israel is in a tough neighborhood and faces unique security challenges, it's also true that Iran has problems of its own. ISIS is a far closer and more proximate threat to Iran than to much of the rest of the world. Hamas in Gaza and Assad in Syria are both weakened by their respective wars. An Israel robustly and unambiguously supported by the United States would be in a position not just to defend herself, but also to press these advantages and to increase the pressure on Iran to modify its behavior. One important way we could achieve this would be to reject the supposed moral equivalence between the Israelis and Palestinian terrorists that has at times been embraced by the Obama administration. In recent days, there have been disturbing reports that the White House was considering economic sanctions against Israel in retaliation for what it views as settlement activity in Israel's capital, Jerusalem. Reports that for several days the administration refused to dispute before belatedly and half-heartedly disagreeing with those allegations. It's difficult to imagine a more complete and stunning indictment of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy than the notion that they might believe we should be sanctioning the nation of Israel and lifting sanctions on the nation of Iran. Truly, along with Alice, we have gone through the looking glass. In addition, the administration has let it be known that if language is properly softened, it may not automatically block a Palestinian bid for a Security Council resolution demanding that Israel withdraw to the untenable 1967 lines. For those concerned about the friendship of Israel, think for a second what this administration is saying, that no longer, if the Obama administration continues on this path, can America be counted on to stand in the Security Council against efforts to undermine the nation of Israel. That is profoundly dangerous. I was therefore particularly pleased that just yesterday, the Senate unanimously passed S-Con Resolution 107, which I authored, which condemns the use of civilians as human shields by Hamas and condemns it as a war crime. This is a bipartisan piece of legislation that was co-sponsored in the Senate by my Democratic colleagues Kirsten Gillibrand and Joe Manchin. passed the United States Senate yesterday 100-0. We are hopeful and optimistic that the House counterpart, led by Republican Ileana Ros-Lehtinen and Democrat Ted Deutsch, will pass this week. Again and again during the Gaza operation, the world condemned Israel, not Hamas, for the loss of civilian lives. Even some of our closest allies joined the chorus, predictably, led by the United Nations Human Rights Council, which voted last July to form a commission of inquiry not into what Hamas did, but into Israel's action defending itself from rockets and terror tunnels designed to kidnap and murder children. The UN Human Rights Council has failed yet again to draw any distinction between Israel's acts of self-defense and the terrorist aggression of Hamas. But my colleagues and I, all 100 members of the United States Senate, understand that the use of human shields by Hamas makes this distinction crystal clear. As Prime Minister Netanyahu so powerfully put it, we're using missile defense to protect our civilians, and they're using their civilians to protect their missiles. Would that we had such clarity from the current administration in America. This quote leads me to one of the most productive of U.S.-Israeli collaborations, which is in the field of missile defense. One of the least objectionable things about the NDAA that is on the Senate floor this week is the ongoing funding for the Israeli defense system, starting with the Iron Dome that proved so effective against Hamas's rockets this year. In addition, we need to continue to partner on the systems to counter longer-range missiles, notably David's Sling and Arrow 2 and 3, which will protect Israel from Iran's weapons and could well prove a game changer of the sort that President Reagan's original brainchild, the Strategic Defense Initiative, did against the Soviets. As Reagan later recalled, quote, "I called a meeting of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, our military leaders, and I said to them, every offensive weapon invented by man has resulted in the creation of a defense against it. Isn't it possible in this age of technology that we could invent a defensive weapon that could intercept nuclear weapons and destroy them as they emerge from their silos?" So SDI was born, and very shortly some in Congress and in the press named it Star Wars. If I had to choose the most important reason on the United States side for the historic breakthroughs that were to occur during the next 5 years in the quest for peace and a better relationship with the Soviet Union, I would say the Strategic Defense Initiative, along with the overall modernization of our military force and the revival of U.S. economic power, would be front and center. Just as the combination of economic pressure and the pressure to keep up with SDI brought down the USSR, so a modern version of this policy, implemented in concert with Israel, might achieve similar results against Iran. The good news is that Great Britain and Israel are only two of the many friends the United States has around the world who have no interest in exchanging our alliance for one with a totalitarian alternative. Our friends in Asia, from India to South Korea to Japan to Taiwan, have resolved to resist the concerted campaign of territorial expansion by the People's Republic of China. We also have significant trade opportunities in Asia, from the bilateral investment treaty we have been negotiating with India for 10 years to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The tiny Baltic nations, all NATO allies, have maintained their independence and are actively seeking to increase their westward rather than eastern integration. Energy partnerships, particularly in LNG, have formed a significant part of this effort, and the United States should move aggressively to support them. I would note this last May when I traveled to Ukraine and Poland and Estonia, as well as the nation of Israel. In all four nations, our friends and allies said the same thing. They would grab you by the shoulder. They'd say, "Where is America?" When America recedes from the world is more dangerous. We need America as the one indispensable nation. In our own hemisphere, our neighbor, the nation of Mexico, is emerging as a partner in the energy renaissance that could make North America finally energy independent. We can also work with Mexico to secure both our southern border and to help combat the corruption and drug trade that is undermining rule of law in Mexico and hampering their attempts to build a prosperous middle class. And this is just waiting to happen. You know, many of us have seen the satellite photo of the Korean Peninsula. That satellite photo shows South Korea lit up at night with prosperity, with abundance. And then the line demarking South and North Korea drawn like a finger from the hand of God. And above that line, darkness. The consequences of totalitarianism and communism and oppression. Well, I would note, with regard to our friend, the nation of the nation of Mexico, there is a similar comparison. Indeed, if one looks at a satellite photograph of South Texas and Mexico, the Eagleford Shale that has produced abundant energy and jobs and prosperity in South Texas, the Eagleford Shale extends well beyond the Rio Grande. And yet the jobs do not. Indeed, I have that satellite photograph here, and one can see like a line cutting across a river that should not otherwise be visible at night. But it is for the simple reason that Mexico's legal system has not created an environment that has encouraged and allowed the development of their natural resources. I'm encouraged that the new government in Mexico is reforming their laws and constitution to enable them to work hand in hand in partnership with us to develop those resources and to strengthen our friendship. I could go on, but this list is meant to be illustrative rather than encyclopedic. The point being that these opportunities are still ours for the taking. But it's high time we started taking yes for an answer with our friends. My travels this year, I've seen over and over again a palpable sense of puzzlement from our allies, notably from the Poles, alarmed by the cancellation of missile defense batteries proposed for Poland and the Czech Republic, to the Canadians, mystified by the failure to approve the Keystone Pipeline. Politely, but urgently, our allies try to explain why these projects are so important to them, not only for practical and immediate security and economic interest, but also as important, tangible demonstrations of their connections to America. While the missile defense for Eastern Europe was originally planned to guard against Iran's ICBM program, they could also have sent a powerful signal to Putin's Russia that the United States remains actively engaged in the defense of our allies in the region, and may well have deterred him from acting so aggressively towards them. Likewise, the Keystone Pipeline would and should serve as a vital artery of energy and jobs and prosperity between the United States and Canada, embodying our mutual commitment to North American security and prosperity. While both these projects are desirable, we should not fall into the trap of thinking that installing one set of missile defense batteries or approving one pipeline would immediately solve all the world's ills. Both were conceived years ago, and we should also look at next steps, such as what a serious and sustained long-term investment in a multi-layered missile defense system, both for us here at home and for our allies abroad would look like. In terms of energy, it would mean bringing together all the extraordinary new resources that have been tapped in the American energy renaissance to unlock a bright future by America and our allies, not dependent on nations like Russia or Iran or Venezuela. These are projects I look forward to tackling when the 114th Congress reconvenes in January. And I hope that my colleagues across the aisle will understand that these should not be partisan initiatives. They are common sense policies that will contribute materially both to our prosperity here at home and our security abroad, as they cement our vital alliances and send a clear signal to our enemies that the Obama administration's policy of appeasement and moral equivalence is at an end. Finally, in a 2002 speech celebrating President Reagan's legacy, Lady Thatcher paid a powerful tribute to his commitment to liberty and his understanding of America's unique role in defending it. The intervening 12 years have proven her prescience, and I would like to conclude with her observations that could have been made this very day. From Lady Thatcher. America today is not just the only global superpower. She enjoys a superiority over any other power or combination of powers greater than any nation in modern times. This also places on her shoulders an awesome responsibility. For the United States, as for any country, national interest must come first, and without apology. But America's interests are so vast that no region lies beyond them. This has three implications, each full of significance for the future. First, America must remain strong. She must again, as under Ronald Reagan, rebuild, reshape, and modernize her defenses. The second implication is that America needs trustworthy allies in every region. America is mighty, but no democracy will tolerate becoming the whole world's policeman. My advice is pick your allies wisely. Support and reassure them, and then insist that they fulfill their promises and commit their resources. Third, particularly in times like these, that the leader of the free world must be seen by your friends and foes alike to speak with unqualified authority. The world respects America more when it knows that the promises and warnings of the U.S. Commander-in-Chief are endorsed by the other main organs of elected government. That message is powerful politics, and it has the still greater merit of being true. Then, as now, we should heed the words of Lady Thatcher. We should embrace peace through strength. We should stand by our friends, and we should defend the values of the United States of America. Thank you. I can do briefly.
Thank you very much, Senator, for your extremely robust remarks. The Senator will now take just a few short...
We'll do two questions. I apologize. I've got a Senate hearing that I have to return to.
Yes, the gentleman right over here. Yeah, go ahead. If you could identify yourself as well.
My name is Charlie Spearing. I'm from Breitbart News. When the Senate released the CIA report this week, President Obama said that this was an opportunity to realize that no nation is perfect and that it was time to look back at what we did during the time after 9/11. And he talked about regaining our moral authority. What's your opinion? Do you think that what occurred after 9/11 hurt our moral authority? And if so, why?
Charlie, thank you for that question. Yesterday was a sad day for the United States and for our friends and allies across the globe. We saw the release of a partisan report from Democrats in the Senate, 6,000 pages, that presented a biased view of what our intelligence officers did in the aftermath of 9/11, and that weakened our nation. It endangered Americans across the globe, and the risk of retaliation, of violence is real. But even more broadly, it demonstrates an approach that has characterized this administration for 6 years, was that everything is George W. Bush's fault. Enough already with blaming George W. Bush for every failure of this administration. At a time when the entire world is on fire, I recognize that President Obama and Senate Democrats see value in hearkening back 6 years ago and piling on to his predecessor. Now let me be clear. Torture is wrong. Unambiguously, period, the end. Civilized nations do not engage in torture. And Congress has rightly acted to make absolutely clear that the United States will not engage in torture. You know, one of the most disturbing consequences of this partisan Democrat report that was released yesterday is the long-term damages this is going to do to our friends and alliances across the globe. The aftermath of 9/11, a great many nations, some traditional friends of America, others not so traditional, worked closely with America combating radical Islamic terrorism. The international repercussions of this partisan report are just beginning as friends and allies across the globe are rethinking, do we want to cooperate with a nation where our cooperation will find itself broadcast to the world through a reckless and irresponsible partisan report? That's one of the consequences, I think, that will be with us for a long, long time. The next time we're reaching out to an ally saying, help us prevent the next 9/11, help us prevent the next terror attack, this report's going to make it all the harder for that friendship and that cooperation to occur. All right, let's do one final question.
There's a hand right at the back. Yeah.
Senator, my name is Dean Cheng. I'm the Senior Research Fellow here at the Heritage Foundation for Chinese Security Affairs. Your speech, for obvious reasons, focused primarily on Europe and also on the Middle East, but I'm glad to see you did mention Asia. Yeah. The question is that the administration has stated that it wants to do a pivot to Asia. The pivot so far seems more like a pump fake than an actual pivot. If you could perhaps address in the coming session, when the Republicans will have taken over the Senate, what you foresee congressional actions with regards to lending some teeth to that pivot.
Look, it is a terrific question. You're right that the administration announced a pivot to Asia. To the extent that pivot has occurred, it's difficult to ascertain. What it seemed to be saying in the pivot to Asia was really a pivot away from the Middle East, a pivot away from radical Islamic terrorists, a pivot away from Russia. And it announced that pivot right before chaos erupted everywhere they were trying to declare victory. With respect to Asia, our allies are feeling alone and abandoned. China and America have a complicated relationship. China's record on human rights is abominable. a sentence, sadly, this administration is very reluctant to utter. China is simultaneously one of our nation's most significant trading partners. And so we have economic interests, and at the same time, we have an obligation to speak out for human rights and be a clarion voice for freedom. And for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. A year ago, when President Obama initially announced his now infamous red line in Syria and then later did nothing on that red line, that statement, combined with a history of not backing up what he said, gave the green light to aggressive or oppressive regimes across the globe. That America is not to be feared. Now, to be clear, last year I did not support military action against Syria because the administration did not articulate a clear national security interest that would be served either by, as John Kerry put it, an unbelievably small attack, or even worse, by toppling Assad if it were to allow chemical weapons to fall into the hand of radical Islamic terrorists in and among the rebels, including ISIS. A world where ISIS has chemical weapons is an even worse world than a world where the monster Bashar Assad is in power. But by declaring a red line and then ignoring the red line, it only encouraged aggressive regimes elsewhere to be all the more bellicose. And when it comes to Asia, China is pressing and pressing and pressing, and will continue pressing until it meets meaningful, credible resistance. Right now, the assessment of the leadership of China is not markedly different from the assessment of the leadership of Russia or the leadership of Iran or the leadership of Venezuela, all of which have concluded that there are no consequences to defying President Obama. Indeed, I would note Venezuela just recently and astonishingly has become a member of the Security Council at the United Nations. I would note, during the Bush administration, Venezuela tried to do that under Chavez, and America blocked it. But now under Maduro, an oppressive socialist who is locking up freedom fighters, who is shooting students in the street, who is taking freedom fighter Leopoldo Lopez, wrongly imprisoning him, and in fact, covering Mr. Lopez with urine and fecal matter. They're a member of the Security Council now because the Obama administration could not act effectively to prevent it. That message is being heard across the globe, and sadly it's being heard by China. It's being heard there are no consequences. And so for the next 2 years, I fear that for aggressive regimes, it's going to be Katie bar the door. Grab as much as you can. Now, the actually 2 bits of encouragement that I can give, and this is a good place to wrap up. The first is, with the new Senate arriving in January, I am hopeful we will see a change in American foreign policy. There is agreement, and in many ways bipartisan agreement in the Senate, that the Obama-Clinton foreign policy is disastrous and is undermining America and the world. And I hope and expect the Senate, without Harry Reid as majority leader, will begin to take up common sense legislation to strengthen our alliances and stand against our enemies, including especially preventing a very, very bad deal with Iran that allows Iran to acquire nuclear weapons capability. So we will see some check, I believe, in the next 2 years on the president's ill-advised foreign policy from a new Congress and a new majority leader. And then more broadly, in 2 years, we will see a new occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And as dire as things are, let me end with a word of encouragement. It's easy to look at the world now and be discouraged, but anyone who remembers back to 1978, 1979, looking at the world then was highly discouraging. We had American hostages languishing in Iran for 444 days. We had a president wringing his hands in trepidation while U.S. helicopters crashed in the desert with no opposing fire. And the point I would make is, as weak as American foreign policy was in 78 and 79, as dark and dire as they were, in 1981, on the day Ronald Reagan was sworn into office, Iran released our hostages. That was not accidental. Foreign policy, as disastrous as it has been, can change every bit as quickly with new leadership, because what is critical in an American president is that he or she have credibility, have the force of his or her word, that our enemies will fear America and our friends will trust us. And it all comes down to whether foreign nations and foreign leaders can trust the President of the United States. And I am hopeful and optimistic that 2 years from now, we will see a very different president whose word can be trusted by friend and foe alike. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for the Margaret Thatcher Freedom Lecture. Thank you very much, Senator Cruz.